Alright everyone, let's talk a little bit about what makes a champion good in Raid Shadow Legends. Now of course, there are a lot of tier lists in Raid Shadow Legends that will give you a general idea without really having to do a lot of research on an individual champion, whether they are good or not. But especially if you're newer to the game or you don't really understand some of the mechanics in the game, if you take a look at a tier list like this, it can be very difficult to really understand the differences between what makes a champion, say, S tier versus maybe what makes that champion A tier or B tier or even C tier. So let's just go into some of the details of things that you want to look at when it comes to champions and what things are going to actually make those champions better in comparison to other champions. Now, a really important thing to know, especially for newer players in Raid Shadow Legends, is even though you might not think this is true, is that the actual raw stats of a champion, and when I'm talking about that, if you go to the champion menu, the actual base stats, except for maybe speed, generally not going to be the best measurement of a champion's overall power. This is another reason why in Raid Shadow Legends, even though rare champions or epic champions in comparison to legendary champions, they will have lower base stats, there are still plenty of really amazing epic champions, and there are even some rare champions that are pretty much just as good as epics or even legendaries. I would even go so far as to say that there are some rare champions that are better than a lot of the legendary champions that there are in the game. So just going off of the rarity, legendary, epic, rare, not going to be a good way to measure a champion's power. Just going off of that champion's base stats like HP, attack, defense, things like that, also not going to be a very good way to measure a champion's power. The main method that is going to be used to measure a champion's power is going to be the skills that that champion has. And that's if you go to the skills menu, you can take a look and see what that champion is going to do. Now, there's a couple of things that you really want to be looking at when it comes to a champion's skills that's going to determine whether that champion is good or whether that champion is generally not going to be as useful. And I want to actually talk about a couple of champions here just as comparison. Let's just go over a champion like Razin Scarhide, which is generally considered to be one of the better legendary champions. Another reason why I wanted to talk about Razin Scarhide is because this is actually a champion that you can actually work on towards fusing. So you don't have to rely on pure RNG from shard pulls to get him. If you are a free-to-play player, there is a chance that you can actually work on getting this champion yourself without having to rely on luck or anything like that. And then let's take a look at a champion which is generally regarded to not be such a great legendary, at least not now, until maybe later in the future when they buffer. That's going to be a champion like Satalia. So if you are a newer player, at first glance, you might take a look and see they're both legendaries, so that seems really good, right? They both have decent stats. The base stats are both not too bad. So that seems to be good. So why is Satalia considered to be a much worse legendary in comparison to Razin Scarhide? Well, the difference is going to really boil down to the skills and what that champion is going to end up bringing to the table. Now, generally speaking, when it comes to skills, what you are looking for is you are looking for things that are going to bring stuff to the table rather than just DPS. Now, that's obviously oversimplifying things a little bit, but if you take a look at the skills, you want to actually see what that champion is going to be bringing to the table. So if we end up taking a look, let's go back to Razin Scarhide. This is going to be our example of a better legendary champion. You'll see that we have our A1. This is going to be the skill that doesn't have a cooldown. It's going to essentially be, I guess you could say, like your auto attack skill. Attacks one enemy 3 times, has a 20% chance of removing one random buff from the target. Damage based on defense, and I'll talk about that in a second because that is also going to be another good determiner or determination method to tell how good a champion is. Then we move on to our second skill. Attacks one enemy, has a 75% chance of placing a 60% decreased defense debuff and a 25% weaken debuff for 2 turns. Then we have our third skill. Attacks all enemies, decreases the turn meter by 100%, damage based on defense. And we have the aura skill, increases ally resist in the arena by 90. So keep in mind those skills as we move on to Satalia now. Skills, put to flame, which is going to be again the A1, or the, you could think of it as like the auto attack because it doesn't have a cooldown. attacks one enemy, has a 30% chance of placing an HP burn debuff for 2 turns, damage based on attack. Then we have our second skill, Lordly Embrace, heals the target ally by 75% of their max HP, and when it's ascended, places a block debuffs buff for 2 turns. We have the third skill, attacks 3 enemies at random, places a 10% leech debuff for 2 turns on the third hit. And finally, we have the fourth skill, the Aura, increases magic ally resist in all battles by 50. So if you're a newer player, it might be very overwhelming. You might be like, okay, that's a lot of stuff that's going on with both champions. Why is one of them good and one of them considered to be not so great? Well, if you go back to Raz and Scarhide, you'll see that there is a lot that he is bringing to the table besides just overall damage. Another thing that is really, really important, especially when it comes to determining your team compositions for more complex battles in the game, and when I say more complex, I'm talking about moving past campaign. When you get to brutal stages in the campaign, the 12th stage, that is going to still be considered generally easy content in comparison to some of the stuff that you'll do later on. Once you start getting to the really high stages of dungeons like stage 20 Dragon, stage 20 Ice Golem, and stage 20 Fire Giant, and especially stage 20 Spider, those battles are much, much more difficult in comparison to the brutal campaign. They are way more complex and they require a lot more from your team. You're going to need a lot of champions that work together very well in order to beat those stages, whereas when you're running the brutal campaign, you really just need one level 60 farmer, and then you can end up using 4 fodder units to level up. So you need a lot of stuff that works together, and that's why Raz and Scarhide is an example of a good champion. It's because not only does he offer basic damage to the table, but he's also going to provide a lot of utility and a lot of debuffs. So we've got our first skill here, which has some utility by removing a random buff from the target, which definitely comes in handy in certain battles where more complex, more difficult bosses buff themselves, and those buffs can end up really making a big difference on how those bosses and how those battles will affect your team. So this is a good A1 skill. Not only that, but it attacks 3 times, and generally speaking, the more times that a skill attacks, the better, because it is going to put more damage to the table when it comes to your masteries, War Master, and Giant Slayer. So that's a good auto attack skill. Now here is a great skill, very, very good example of a fantastic skill, and a skill that is going to turn a champion from not so great into a very good champion because of how many debuffs it brings to the table. So we have attacks an enemy, has a 75% chance of placing a 60% decreased defense debuff and a 25% weakened debuff. So right off the bat, this skill has 2 very, very strong, very high-end debuffs built into it. So lots of utility, and this skill is going to really, really work well with your team to be able to tackle those more difficult challenges in the game. So this is the kind of stuff that you have to think of when it comes to building more complex teams in Raid Shadow Legends, is to make sure that not only do you have a lot of damage, not only do your champions have the skills and utility to survive these battles, but they also have to have the right combination of buffs and debuffs just because of how difficult these battles can end up being. And having these 2 very strong debuffs built into one skill right here is a great example of a fantastic skill. Then we have our third skill, which is going to be a fantastic utility skill. Even though it has a very long cooldown, it is an AoE, attacks all enemies, decreases the turn meter by 100%, and that is huge, especially again in the arena and in those more complex battles where the difference between the enemy taking a turn and you taking turns can really kill a lot of team members or make a very big difference on the impact of the battle. Finally, we have the Aura skill, which is not really too great because resist in the arena, there's better aura skills, but even though a champion has one skill that might not be considered to be too great, or maybe has an aura skill that might not be considered to be too great, if it has other skills that bring a lot to the table, they give you a lot of utility and are going to really help with that team composition synergy, in those more complex battles, that is going to be the difference that makes a champion good, and also the difference when it does end up coming to these tier lists. Those are going to be the things that people who build these tier lists consider when it comes to bumping up champions' overall grades from things like C, B, or A to something like an S tier. Is going to be those utility and those synergy skills, those buffs, debuffs, and things like that. Now, something else that I didn't really talk about too much is going to be this thing right here where it says damage based on defense. This is also very important as well, because this is going to determine what actual stat is going to be the determining factor for what the damage is based off of. Now, there's a few different possibilities here. You can have damage based on defense, you can have damage based on attack, and you can also have damage based on HP, and Sir Nicholas is an example off of that. So what this means is, whereas you might normally think that attack or the damage that you do is going to be based off of the attack stat, if you end up having something else as this right here, like damage based on HP or damage based on defense, then the actual damage that you do is going to be scaled off of that stat rather than attack. And generally speaking, it's actually better for champions to scale off of defensive stats like defense or HP, and the reason is because, again, in those more difficult battles, the enemies and the bosses are doing so much damage that if you have skills that are scaled off of defense, not only is a good defense going to bring more defense to your actual champion and allow you to end up surviving those later stages and later boss fights, but you're also increasing your damage. So it's kind of like knocking out two birds with one stone. Whereas if you have champions that are based off of attack, they are possibly going to suffer from having those defensive stats to be able to survive in those more difficult stages. So that's definitely something to consider, and something else that is possibly going to move champions up those tier lists. Now let's take a quick look at Satalia, which is a champion that, again, not really too great, not really too high up on those tier lists, at least not now. Maybe she'll end up getting a buff later on, but she is a legendary, so you might think she's good, but when you take a look at the actual skills that she has, she's not really bringing a whole lot to the table. Now you've got the A1, which is going to be the auto attack with no cooldown, attacks one enemy, has a 30% chance of placing an HP burn debuff for 2 turns. Now HP burn is okay in something like the clan boss. It's not going to be as useful as poison, because poison you can stack, but HP burn you can only actually apply that once, so it's not terrible for something like the clan boss, but overall not the best A1 skill. Then we move on to the second skill, which is going to be heals the target ally by 75% of their max HP and places a block debuffs for 2 turns. Again, situationally decent. You know, there's some times where this might come in handy, but, you know, not really going to be providing those debuffs or those buffs, and it's going to be too situational to really be useful in certain encounters. And finally, you have the third skill here, or I guess not finally, there's the aura skill still. Attacks 3 enemies at random, places a 10% leech debuff for 2 turns on the third hit. Leech is just going to essentially drain HP. You know, there's just not really a lot of utility. There's not really a lot of stuff that Satalia can add to the table. There's no buffs, there's no debuffs. It's going to be very difficult with these 3 skills to find a place to put Satalia on your team for a very difficult battle like Spider 20 or Dragon 20, Ice Golem 20, Fire Giant 20. Those battles are going to be complex and difficult enough to the point where every champion that you have on your roster is really going to have to bring something to the table rather than just having a few situational skills. They might seem good at they might seem good at first glance, and they might be good in certain situations, but if you don't have those buffs, if you don't have those debuffs, if you don't have that fantastic utility, it's just going to be very difficult to place champions like this on teams for very complex dungeons. You have the aura skill as well, increases magic ally resistant all battles by 50. Not that great of an aura, and overall, while the stats might seem good, while she is a legendary champion, she just doesn't end up bringing enough to the table to justify adding her to most teams to do those complex dungeons. So that in combination is going to lower her overall score on tier lists, and I believe she's also an attack-based champion, which is going to make it more difficult for her to even survive in those more difficult battles. So I wanted to just go over a couple of champions as an example. I also wanted to pick out 2 legendary champions. The reason being because a lot of newer players might think that every legendary in Raid Shadow Legends is going to be good, but that is definitely not the case. There are plenty of legendaries that are not going to be too great. And like I said at the start of the video, there are plenty of epic champions and even rare champions which are going to be better than certain legendary champions. So don't just think of how rare a champion is when it comes to how good they're going to be. There's a number of different factors, and overall the things that I mentioned in this video are going to be the things that you want to base whether champions are going to be good or not. If you want to be a little bit more specific, you can always take a look at tier lists. Nothing wrong with that. Hopefully after this video you guys have a little bit more of a general understanding of what makes champions good versus not good, so that you don't absolutely have to rely on these tier lists to know. So thank you guys for watching. I hope that you guys learned a bit from this video. If you guys do have any questions or anything, feel free to let me know in the comments section, of course. And if you guys did enjoy this video and you want more videos like this in the future, consider subscribing to the channel and of course dropping a like as well. Thank you very much to all of you guys who are new from the Raid Shadow Legends who have subscribed to the channel, and those of you who are liking the videos. Really do appreciate it, everyone. With that all being said, that's going to be it for today. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day, and until next time, this is Salt of the Salty Guild, signing out.